This is a virtual reading of Conspirators, to each his own agenda. Prologue. Whoever decided that the High Temple be situated at the top of 1,000 stairs must surely have been thrown from the top of them. This was the thought that ran through the young acolyte as he made his mile-long journey through the capital of the Roman kingdom and stood exhausted at the foot of the towering marble mass that led to the High Temple. The entire temple district of the city was an extravagant delight that could only be described in the contrasts of the poverty-stricken slums that the acolyte had to travel through to get to it. Already the stairs were starting to fill with the daily beggars hoping to get free money and food from those seeking redemption. Eager to put distance before them before they rounded on him in his pure white robes, he began to make the climb. The temple district was built as a bustle of cathedrals and archways, which meant daylight only really hit the ground during the late morning and early afternoon, so at this early hour one could be forgiven for believing it was still night. At one point a contest had been thrown to see who could do the climb the fastest. The record was constantly quoted during his initiation ceremony, when he was given the slave-like duty of carrying the sacramental wine up the stairs days at a time. His hatred for those unburdened by the heavy loads had kept him going, and now he had a physique similar to that of a hardened legionary. After time lost in thought, he finally reached the top. The entrance to the temple was equally as impressive as everything around it, with gold-plated handles and ruby-eyed eagles in heavy bronze statues standing vigil over the door. The floor before the door was a blackened tiled slab with a perfectly embossed silver over silver fountain, the iconic Sangreal that stood at the top of the Great Pyramid at the centre of the city. Guarding the great door to the temple were two fountain-court hoplites. These sinister and silent warrior monks stood unblinkered in their white robes and gleaming silver armour. These men represented the very best of all soldiers, and were loyal only to the High King of Rome, now lost for centuries. They didn't acknowledge him as he passed, and he did nothing to acknowledge them in return. This was the way with them. The temple opened out into a grand cathedral, with a high vaulted ceiling, and windows filled with the material only seen in the High Temple itself. Glass. When the acolyte had first seen it, he had promised himself he would learn everything about it, and though many years had passed since, his desire never changed. He walked through the open space, past wealthy and privileged men and women, making the first offerings to the Father and other gods Rome had conquered in its time. He held onto his satchel bag more tightly, ironically fearing theft here than when he had lived in slums. The raptores and gangs there respected a pious man, and often assumed their treatment to such men would mean good standing with the Father in death. Here, however, the other acolytes would relish any chance to make his life misery, just on the principle, and today was the last day that could happen. It was the day of his doctorate, the day where he would present an essay he'd been working on for over a year to move up the religious ranks and become an apprentice. As thrilling thoughts filled his head, he entered an side corridor to meet his tutors. Most of them regarded him without notice, while those who knew what he was about offered him encouragement in the form of a stern and inaudible grumble. The apprentices were having their morning meal, and he attempted to hurry past them, but he wasn't fast enough. Several of them, who seemed to have been waiting for him, blocked his way, with smirks and folded arms. The acolyte swallowed, knowing what was coming. He knew better than to expect help from anybody, or to appeal to their good nature. These were the sons of wealthy men, without a single drop of piety in their blood. They got into the apprenticeship immediately after secret payments were made, and soon they would see the priesthood, and later the bishopry. The acolyte looked forward to seeing them leave more than he feared the idea of living with them. These thoughts were quickly banished as they made their taunting remarks and congratulated each other on their imagination. He maintained his respectful nature with difficulty. He had learned the hard way that the priesthood would be far happier to punish him than them for any disturbance. His desperation to reach the meeting took over, and he stood taller. "I have been summoned by the college cardinals," he said, with a touch of pride in his voice. He had hoped the titles would talk him down. It didn't. All it did was encourage a round of jeers and laughter. They closed in. "Look, boys," the leader said, his jeer showing perfectly formed teeth, maintained only by wealth. "He breaks bread with the college now. He thinks he's better than us. Maybe we should put him in his place." There was a greedy tone of agreement throughout the six of them, and the leader took the opportunity to step forward and wrestle the satchel from the grip in one fluid movement. It caught the acolyte off guard, and the cold leather slipped through his fingers as he was suddenly grabbed from behind. Without a word, the apprentices dragged him through the door into the corridor that led to the College of Cardinals. No one made any reaction, nor sign that they would. The beating lasted for a full 2 minutes, and at the end of it, the acolyte was a bloody mess on the floor, barely conscious. Blood leaked into his eye, but he could see clearly enough to see them empty his satchel onto the floor. The 3 scrolls that contained his doctorate clattered to the floor, and the 3 of the apprentices turned their cups over them, sending the blood-red morning wine splashing over the delicate papyrus and the ink into oblivion. The leader stood over him, and cupped his broken chin in his hand. "No," he said audibly. "You're." He undid his breeches. "Place." And he urinated over his broken body. They left, the corridor ringing with laughter. It took a long time for the acolyte to gather his strength enough to move, long enough for the half of the priesthood to pass him, and either tut disapprovingly at him, or laugh at his discomfort. Eventually, he pulled himself to his feet. His face was a blood-stained mess, and he stunk of wine and piss. He flapped his arms in a useless attempt to sweep away the stink and humiliation before he pulled himself to his feet. He resisted the urge to wipe his face, knowing all too well that the leader had specifically pissed into his sleeves to make him wipe his face with it. He reached out and picked out the destroyed remains of a year's work. He knew he'd already failed his doctorate. His lateness would not be excused, and he had to provide a written copy of his work to prove his ability to write. He threw the sodden paper aside and wept as he climbed the stairs to the college. At the top of the stairs there were 2 priests, those who had been assigned to maintain the college. They noted his dishevelled appearance and the aroma with distaste, and told the acolyte they had heard everything that had happened, and they revelled in it just as much as the apprentices had. They saw him in with a slow pushing of the door to the college that caused it to rumble around the wide room as they entered. It was a massive chamber, large enough to comfortably hold over 1,000 people. There were only 7 in the room, the 6 pontiffs of Rome and the high priest, John the 12th. The high priest was an immensely fat and somewhat slimy man who rang with corruption and decadence. Everyone in the high temple knew that he was a man to enjoy his position at the top of the religion and the power they had brought him. His orgies and gambling rings were well known throughout both nobility and the underground. The pontiffs were simply his pawns, and showed just as much promise to follow in his footsteps upon his highly sought-after demise. The high priest's expression never changed, while the pontiffs gave him disapproving looks. "You're late," his droning voice informed him, his nose upturned. The acolyte sniffed past his tears. He had hoped in the deep recesses of his being they might give him comfort or outrage on his behalf, but, of course, he was left wanting. He knew better than to offer the truth, and simply apologized. One of the pontiffs held out the hand for his written doctorate. "My apologies," he said, tears now welling in his eyes. "My papyrus was destroyed." The pontiff retracted his hand without reaction. "A pity," the high priest said. "Had you not spent your time getting besotted with wine and fight, that could have been avoided. I do not need to remind you such practices are forbidden in the priesthood." Rage seethed in the acolyte, so much so one of his teeth that had been knocked loose parted painfully from his mouth. He choked as his mouth filled with blood. His vision swayed ahead of him, and he forced himself to remain calm and swallow the putrid mug. "Yes, Your Holiness," he panted, almost double-oved in pain. "I trust you have at least something to present to us?" one of the pontiffs glowered. "I would move we postpone the event," another spoke up. "Clearly this boy has no concept of proper attire etiquette. It would be unholy to admit such a man to the apprenticeship. The standard of our holy church must not be slandered." His words were cruel, but the acolyte could visibly see something like sympathy behind the man's eyes. There was a murmur of agreement, and the acolyte dared to hope, as blood dripped from his mouth. The high priest held up his hand, however. "Wise words, Cardinal. But my time is not so easily spent that I can wait on a blood-stained drunkard. You will present your doctorates presently, and pray the Father has given you enough talent to look over your tardiness." The matter was settled. The pontiff settled, and all was quiet. The acolyte swallowed blood again, and wiped his bloodied face on his urine-stained sleeve. He didn't care any more. He took in a deep breath, standing tall despite his pain, and began to recite. He committed his words to memory, and spoke with as much pride as he could muster. He spoke of the origins of the world, of the immortals, who the people of the world revered as gods. He spoke of the war in the heavens that brought about the mortal world, and the wars that ensued afterwards. He listed the immortals of significance, from the Roman immortal Conspirators, to the immortals of the barbarians to the north, to the Orientals to the east, and the desert people to the south. After nearly an hour of dictation, he moved on to the exotems, a series of ritualistic world wars that occurred every 500 years. With an urgency he couldn't explain, he rushed into an account of how the Romans won each of the exotems and established their empire throughout the known world, ending with the disastrous events that ended the royal bloodline of the Roman kingdom. From here he moved on to a phase of history known as the Age of Dictators, describing the Roman warlords who had seized power one after another until they had reached the current dictator. He concluded with a summary of current events, mentioning the Athenian prince and the consul of Rome, both of whom were leading the war effort against the Sand People rebellion, and theorized what might happen in the political sphere whence they returned from the front. Despite the nods and clear approval that had lifted him through this talk, the mood was somber when he finished. The high priest had stopped looking down at him, and he now fixed him with a definitive glare. The pontiffs who hadn't noticed were already providing feedback. Words like artistry and academic brilliance were used, but as the pontiffs applied their applause, the room began to quieten as the high priest's mood became apparent. He stood up, which sent a ripple of awe throughout the others. It was clearly something that had never happened before. He was purple with rage, his belly sagging out onto the table under his robes. "This is the high temple of Rome, boy," he spat. "Our beloved dictator is a legitimate ruler, loved by our people and the Father above. Your political views have no place in this holy sanctuary. Slander and innuendo will not be tolerated. Leave this chamber. Report to your holy master, and see to it that he punishes you for your disgusting behavior and indecency. Your doctoria is rejected in every way the Father allows. Go now, and see that your lies are washed from your mouth. Pray the Father sees fit to grant you forgiveness." The acolyte stood stunned, unable to process the sudden change in his fortune. He trembled, unable to move. The high priest glared, his patience evaporating. Two guards, who had remained unnoticed, grabbed the acolyte by his crippled arms and threw him roughly through the door. He broke down completely, curling up into a ball and weeping. The corridor was completely enclosed, and no light entered from outside. The torches flickered and spat on the walls as he lay there, tucked away to the side. After an age, he heard footsteps, which slowed as they approached. He wiped his nose and sat up. He rose painfully to his feet as he saw the leader of the gang who had ruined his life. The man laughed as he saw the acolyte, sunk so low. He let out a sarcastic sound of sympathy. "Didn't they like your project? Did they see you for what you really are?" The acolyte didn't answer, suddenly fascinated by the torch on the wall. The apprentice frowned, wondering if the acolyte hadn't heard him. He poked him in the shoulder. "I'm talking to you, peasant." The acolyte ignored him, reaching out to pick up the metal torch that hung on the bracket on the wall. The flames licked his skin, but he didn't notice it as he lifted it out. "What are you doing?" the apprentice demanded, his confusion mixing with his amusement. The acolyte didn't remember hitting the apprentice, nor how many times he hit him when he was down. But he remembered the look on the man's face as his life left him, and strangely, the sounds of his own footsteps as he walked away.